Welcome back, guys, to the Beyond Condition podcast, the voice of bodybuilding. And today's voice is a returning guest. Stan Efferding joins me with a very nice, picturesque view of a swimming pool in the background.
Yeah, this is my house in Las Vegas, Nevada. I've got an indoor pool here. So I come out here where the lighting's good and it's quiet. The rest of the house is quite noisy with my kids and my family and everybody else running around.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And you were just telling me about a recent trip. So maybe you could expand a little bit more so the listeners can hear all about it.
Yeah, I was just a couple of weeks ago. I spent 6 days in Podgorica, Montenegro. Uh, Over here on our side of the ocean, most of us probably don't know where that is. You guys are quite familiar, the former Yugoslavia, right there, just on the opposite side of the Adriatic Sea from Italy. But it was I'd never been there before, and it was absolutely beautiful there. And I went to do a seminar on strength and conditioning and nutrition, kind of the common topics that I get invited to speak on. And I was just mentioning that there was one thing in particular that stood out to me, being from the United States and the standard American diet, is that there was very little obesity in Montenegro. There was, it doesn't mean that everybody was at their peak level of fitness. There was little pot bellies here and there, but it just wasn't to the degree, the morbid obesity that we see here. And I correlated that to the fact that there were very few fast food restaurants. There was one Burger King that I saw. And I don't know if that's intentional as far as legislation in that region, but I noticed there were lots of cafes and that people would sit out for, a couple hours for lunch, a siesta, I suppose, is what they would refer to it as. Yeah. But the food was served slowly. It was mostly, whole foods. And it was something that stuck out to me. It was quite different than what we experience here in the United States, where it's just very commonplace to see folks that are very overweight and obese. And I know that's generally the topic of conversation on your show and today. So I kind of wanted to open with that there's some very simple things that seem to contribute to our weight problem.
Two things actually standing out there from my point of view as well is that one, of course, the subliminal messaging that we're inundated with, and it's very similar in the UK. You can't even drive down a motorway without seeing several fast food chains. And, when you repeatedly see advertisement, of course, that stores in the subconscious, and then you've only got to be a bit hungry or, short for time, various other reasons. And then suddenly you find yourself eating certain foods, and maybe it's not even a conscious thought, but it's something that's in the subconscious that it's like, okay, I need to grab something to eat. I'll stop here, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, it is convenient, fast food. It's affordable. It's delicious. It's specifically orchestrated and chemically designed by scientists to be hyper palatable, which bypasses our normal satiety signals. And we know from a lot of research to suggest that a comparative diet of whole foods versus fast food, that people tend to eat about 500 more calories a day before they're satiated, and which obviously contributes to the obesity epidemic. And there's some specifics that go into that, which we can dive into today. But I just wanted to, everybody always asks me, what's the cause of the obesity epidemic? And I did an obesity rant many years ago where I spoke of these very things that we tend to overconsume. It's really just the overconsumption of calories. Now, many things contribute to that, and fast food is certainly one of those things. But generally speaking, it's just energy toxicity. We just eat more now than we used to eat 50 years ago. And there's a lot of people who have differing opinions as to how to solve that problem, but ultimately that is the problem.
For sure. And also where you said about the slower service and people spending more time eating, when we even look from a digestion point of view, and actually, if you're cramming food in ordinarily, you can have more, and then you can sometimes get this sort of dump, can't you, where it's like, well, I'm really full up if you have essentially overconsumed. But also it's something I work with my clients to do, is this sort of mindful eating approach. So being,
Yes.
you know, and I love that, because particularly in a prep or a diet, you know, you've got a lot of boxes to tick, as we call it. And actually, are you present with your food? Are you grateful for the food that you have? Because it's something I talk about, you know, there's countries that are in poverty, and the gift of eating is something they would love to have. And I think that's super important for people to sort of rein it back sometimes and go, do you know what, I'm going to sit with my meal and enjoy this, the nutrition, and see food as health rather than how much satiety can I get, and what is your satiety, right? You know, depending on your upbringing, etc.
Yeah, I have a whole satiety index, or a list of things that kind of help with that.
Nice.
Obviously, the obvious things are more whole foods, less ultra processed foods, more protein, more fiber, uh, more high satiety foods. There's a satiety index which rates a user's experience as to how long they stay full on certain foods. And of course, fiber and protein are high on that index, but so are things like boiled potatoes, very high on the satiety index. Oranges. There's a host of foods that are high in water and fiber and lower in energy density, which we should get into today, that help. And there's also some other things, like you mentioned, mindful eating. It's not always hunger that we eat. There's a host of other reasons why we eat. Is boredom,
Yep.
stress, trauma, social situations. I had a lady was telling me about her kids eating junk food, and she said something like, I can't remember the number of days, but it was a lot of days a year that lent themselves to be considered special occasions. And you could, not just holidays. We know that the majority of the weight we gain each year occurs during that holiday season between Thanksgiving and New Year's. And we don't tend to lose all of what we gained over the holidays throughout the rest of the year. But there's other events. If your kid's in school with 30 other kids, that's 30 birthdays. And every one of those birthdays is going to have at school, cupcakes or cookies, depending on your class, your school, and their age. It could even be church on Sunday. It could even be, just other special occasions, treats, those kinds of things. And there's many other holidays that people celebrate with food. But it's a lot of days when you start to look at it. It's not occasionally. It tends to be every third day. There's some special occasion, or hey, great job on the test, buddy, and great job at the soccer game, which of course we want to reward any kind of physical effort, but we commonly burn a few hundred calories exercising and then go out and throw back 600, 700, 900 in response to that. So, but there's a lot of reasons why people overconsume food, and part of mindful eating, as you mentioned, is recognizing what am I doing here? How often do I end up at these places shoveling down exorbitant amount of calories?
Yeah, for sure. And something I'm sure you probably work on with clients as well is sort of in that same subject there. How do you frame food? And like you mentioned there, food is associated with pretty much every emotion. You can be extremely happy or extremely sad, or you're eating for fuel and just eating because this is something that humans do. So I feel like sometimes, if particularly in a diet, if you're told to sort of just get on with it and stick to your plan and what have you, it's not addressing the elephant in the room, that actually our clients are going to have many, many emotions and past experiences related to the foods that they eat. So when we turn and, go into a diet and it's like, well, you need to eat this plan, sometimes for people it's extremely hard. And then the likelihood of, going off track, not sticking to the plan, or binging, over consuming, is so much higher. But that comes over time. And this is why it's so important that as coaches, and any coaches listening, laying down with those clients initially, let's have a period of time where I understand your eating, your past, and let's make a plan together, rather than crack on and, essentially people do fall off the wagon, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's important that you said that in the United States, we have what's a long-term study called the Weight Control Registry, where we have over 10,000 participants who have lost more than 60 pounds and kept it off for at least 5 years.
Nice.
And 98% of them, we look at what are successful behaviors. Success, gives us clues. 98% of them went on a diet. And so it's important to have a plan, like you said. The challenge is that plan, are you setting yourself up for failure by creating something that's too restrictive right out of the gate, something that's inconsistent with your personal preferences and your lifestyle and what have you? So the plan, a goal is I want to lose 20 pounds. That's not a plan.
Yeah.
Right. A plan is, how am I going to achieve that? What kind of behaviors am I going to engage in? What kind of habits can I begin to employ that are lifetime habits, so that this has become something that's simple, sensible, and sustainable, that you won't go on and off. It has to become a lifestyle, not a short-term goal. That's why I hate using the word diet, of course. It always tends to create the connotation of a temporary thing, right?
Yeah.
Your diet is what you eat, and it should meet all of your needs and your wants and your goals. There's many of those as can coexist. And so I think it's important that you have a plan, but that plan is also something that you can adhere to long term. And so I'm really cautious when I create diets for people. I want to be able just to print out a blanket diet and give it to everyone. It's certainly cost effective for me.
Yeah, for
But
sure.
in fact, I have to give a detailed questionnaire with food preferences and find out what they enjoy, when they like to eat, where they typically eat. People who travel a lot may have some restrictions in their ability to cook foods, and then the kinds of foods they like to eat. And one of the things on that satiety list that's very important, there are certain foods that you should limit. There's no question. We talked earlier about energy density, which we should get into in greater detail, but it's very important, because we know psychologically that you have alternatives for those. You have replacements, because our hedonistic behaviors are kind of based on convenience. And if there's a tub of ice cream in the freezer, you're going to eat it. There's no way around it. Willpower is not a good strategy for weight loss. You'll lose that battle every time. But if you employ some strategies, as we mentioned, with those satiety strategies, to keep yourself full or less hungry, less often, so that you can bridge the gap between meal times as opposed to white knuckling it. And one of those strategies is to try and eliminate or make it less convenient to access those foods, even though you can incorporate a small amount of them into your diet. Having them readily available doesn't lend itself well to a small amount. You end up binging on them. And so I try and get all those foods out of the house. It doesn't mean you can't on occasion travel and get a dessert somewhere. Ideally split it with your significant other, so you're getting half the calories.
Eat it slowly.
Without sabotaging each other. But then you have to have alternatives there. And I guess, to be specific, if you're an ice cream eater, a great alternative would be like a Greek yogurt with berries. And you can even get one of those ninja foodies and make an ice cream out of it,
Yes.
with some ice. And there's things like popcorn, of course. I know that's cliche, but it's very effective for managing. Some of those are just munchy behaviors that you have in front of the TV at night. You kind of just want to sit there and crunch on something. That's a great alternative that's low calorie, presuming that you air pop it yourself. And because the bags of popcorn at Costco have about 8,000 calories, and then they're loaded with coconut oil. And again, not to demonize any particular food, but we should become aware of the number of calories that are in our food. It's an education process. Not saying you have to count calories forever, but you should at least know how to balance your budget and know where those major calories are coming from, back to the energy density conversation. But I like, there's a jerky called biltong, which is very low in carbs. And some jerkies are cured with brown sugar and some other ingredients that can add calories. But the biltong is very low in calories. It's still soft. So I'm just saying that you kind of got to make yourself a list of low-calorie snacks. You can even Google it and have them available there in the house to go to, just to sit there and be able to do this while you're watching TV, because that's certainly a pretty common habit of ours. And that way, I think you could be more successful without trying to just utilize willpower as a strategy.
Yeah, for sure. Something I also deploy, as it were, is, if I have clients that are struggling in a diet, perhaps there's a personal circumstance or something's come up, having a potential allowance so that, if they're not going to contact me when it's happening and they are more hungry, I say, okay, so let's have a 200-calorie buffer. And, if it's then used, I have still the client tracking that. I still have data, and we can then still be, really on point with what's happening on this journey. Whereas if there's not certain tools, sometimes that lead into a binge that's out of control, or they sort of lose track of what they've eaten. It's then very difficult sometimes for someone to get back on track, and also the guilt and shame that's associated with overeating. It can really, really hit people, and also that ability to then stop and get back on the bandwagon, the next day or what have you. Whereas if there is this allowance and it's person dependent, I feel like sometimes, because that's in the plan, as it were, then that guilt and shame isn't as associated with that. And it's like, well, I've done what my coaches sort of allowed me for, and I did use that resource this week. Following week I didn't. But it's, of course, person dependent, but it's something I like to utilize if it's appropriate for that person.
Yeah, let's give some examples for people. I get lots of clients that call me up and say, Stan, I'm headed out to eat with the wife tonight. We're celebrating a particular occasion. What do you suggest? And if the opportunity presents itself, I would suggest a place that served lean meats, alternatively to, say, Italian or pizza. It's really hard to get a lean protein meal at a pizza place. So I would pick a lean steak. But the difference between grilling a lean steak at home, say in a Ninja grill or something, which is an air fry, which might yield, for a 6-ounce serving, less than 400 calories of steak, probably 300 something actually, of a good top sirloin steak. Now, if you go to Ruth Chris and get a steak, it's probably going to be a ribeye or a New York, and it's going to have an entire cube of butter melted on top of it, and you're talking about an 1,800 calorie steak. So those are some things that you have to be aware of in terms of the fatty cut of meat that you eat and the preparation, whether it's in a pool of oil or with butter. And again, not demonizing any foods in particular, just understanding the calorie density of those foods. So that's one thing to consider. A flame grilled lean meat, whether it's chicken or salmon or steak, it would be ideal. And then with the salad, obviously, you'd want to get the dressing on the side. Just dip your fork in it as opposed to bathing the salad in the vinegar and oil, because those are just real calorie dense. The sauces, the dips, the mayonnaise, those kinds of things can add calories really quickly. And then, so now you've got a steak salad, that kind of thing. And then again, I mentioned getting a smaller dessert, or hopefully they've got berries with a little scoop of ice cream, and you can split some of the ice cream. It kind of depends, or fruit, would be ideal. And then if you're going to have a drink, you want to try and be careful of what's added to the drinks. Some of those, the Red Bulls and whatever else that have a lot of additional calories, the juices, probably better just to put some lemon into a straight vodka or something that, whatever your preference is, lemon or lime into that. And then alternate with, another beverage, an iced tea or diet soda. And mentioning that when you get to the restaurant, of course, there's bread and butter, and maybe you just do a little bit of bread and skip the butter. Now, again, not that butter is bad for you, but it really is very calorie dense. And then fluids before your meal comes. If you can consume, when you sit down, order a Coke Zero and an iced tea. That's not to get into a conversation about artificial sweeteners. That's a whole nother quagmire. But if you're trying to control caloric intake, consuming a sufficient amount or a decent amount of fluids prior to eating helps. Stomach has what's called rugae, the folds of the stomach, and when that expands, it sends a signal to the brain. So there's two things to consider. It's the stretch of the stomach, and it's the time that it takes to consume. And usually when you're eating dinner out, the time component is better than fast food. So you're going to probably, by the time your meal gets there, after you've had a dinner salad and a piece of bread and diet soda or an iced tea, 20, 30 minutes has already transpired. So you're kind of into a safe zone there if you can just not gorge your food. So that's one, if you're in charge of planning, that's one option. The other option is if you're headed to a pizza place with your buddies, now you really got to want to order that dinner salad. And I know they're not terribly great. It's just a little iceberg lettuce with a shave of carrot and a tomato on it. And but usually most pizza places have cucumber and tomato. And I'll go to pizza places with my kids sometimes, and it's just it's hard not to eat an entire freaking pizza. That's the thing. It's so delicious that if you can just keep yourself down to a half or 2 or 3 pieces, that's a win. How do you do that? You have to find other ways to satiate yourself in that environment, and that would be the dinner salad prior, along with the iced tea and the diet soda. If that was, I'm saying both. I'm not saying one or the other even. I'm saying an iced tea and the diet soda. You'd have to try and get yourself sufficiently full, or your stomach sufficiently full, to where you're less inclined to jam down the rest of that pizza. And that those would be, some options to try and minimize. And once you start pouring beer on top of that, it's, at some point we have to exercise some restraint, or I don't think we're not unaware. It's just that, if we go into it with the knowledge. And lastly, and this is one that people think I'm a little overzealous about, but sometimes if I have to be at a particular event that's going to be serving food that I don't necessarily need to eat or don't even want to eat because it irritates my digestion, I'm just not interested in that. It reminds me of the quote I've been selling around for years now. I don't eat foods I like, I eat foods that like me. And I make that decision about an hour after I eat. And sometimes people ask me about, how are you so disciplined? And I'm like, I'm not necessarily all that disciplined. I don't look at foods necessarily for their immediate satisfaction. I recognize when something's going to cause me a discomfort later. And it's pretty easy for me to avoid it because I know I'm going to end up on the toilet, not to be too crass here, but that's just the end result of a lot of those things. And I don't particularly enjoy that. And another thing is when you eat, I hate to use this word, clean a lot, those types of foods, the Carl's Jr. and what have you, will wreak more havoc on you. I say that was the term I always, you stray, you pay. And I've had people get upset with me. They'll get on the vertical diet or, start eating more whole foods, less ultra processed foods. And, a month later, they'll be like, hey, Stan, I used to be able to eat this or that. And now if I eat it, it just wreaks havoc on my digestion. They're almost upset at me that they can't eat some of the foods that they used to eat without significant, gastric distress. So to get back to the wedding or whatever, the event that you're invited to where you don't want to necessarily eat their food, or there's not going to be any healthy options, either you don't eat and just have some, iced tea, diet soda, or you eat prior, eat before you leave the house, and then maybe just have an appetizer there or something small. And then there's the ultimate, I've very often taken my own food certain places, with those that wouldn't, appear to be offensive, to sit there at a wedding eating out of my thermos. I'd do it. I would do it in a heartbeat. But I know other people would feel self-conscious about that. But I would take a meal. Quick story, sorry to rant, but these are funny things. I live here in Las Vegas. I don't drink. I don't gamble. I rarely can stay up past 10. I'm an old man here. So I don't know why I moved here. I really don't know. I don't enjoy any of the benefits of Las Vegas, I suppose. But on about 2 occasions in the last dozen years, my wife and I have gone out for New Year's, which is always a mistake in Vegas because you get stranded down there in a traffic jam and you can't get out for hours. But one time in particular, when I went out and I was wearing a suit coat, the security asked me to empty my pocket and warned you on the way in. And I'm reaching into my pocket and I'm pulling out a sandwich. And I'm pulling out a hard-boiled egg and some nuts and a half an orange that was in a Ziploc bag. And he just looks at me and he shakes his head. He goes, put it away, put it away. Because he was, the security guard was a big Samoan guy who was familiar with me from social media. And he's like, just put it away. And he let me go in. But I took to Las Vegas to go to a nightclub, I took little snacks so that when I was in the nightclub with my friends, I didn't get voraciously hungry or start binging on chips and garbage that I knew would make me feel terrible. Instead, I had a little, maybe a turkey sandwich and a half an orange and a hard-boiled egg and some nuts. The same little treat I often take to the theater with me.
Yeah.
I'll make this little, theater pack that I'll go in, and when I'm in the theater, I'll eat a hard-boiled egg and some mixed nuts and maybe some little pieces of cheddar cheese. And instead of buying, obviously, the popcorn and candy that's there, and that's another strategy that I have to try and manage that circumstance, which is, the popcorn at movie theaters is unbelievably dense in calories. So tastes good, but it'll wreak havoc on a diet.
Yeah, for sure. Also, it raises quite a good point, actually. I don't know if I've ever spoken about this on the podcast before, but when you're in a prep, of course, socializing changes and your narrative changes, as it were, as to what you're going to take part in, essentially. And I actually was in a prep once, and I did what you said. I took some food with me in my little bum bag. So I went to a music event, and I emailed ahead. They emailed me back to say that's okay to take some food in, because obviously they search you like you described. And I got there, I had the email, and the guy, probably similar to the security guard you came across, he lifted, you could tell he did. And I was like, I'm in a bodybuilding prep, is it okay that I bring some food in? And he was like, yeah, no problem. And it was almost like, this is quite cool. And, in a prep, in a diet as well, there's a level of commitment that is required. And, there's those alternative ways of thinking that as coaches, we can empower and give those guidelines, but you've got to want to do it. And of course, that's quite a big subject in regards to, wanting to actually change your life and not resenting process, because I come across it a lot, Stan, and I'm sure you have in your time, people that moan and resent what they're doing. And it's almost not that I want to be flippant, but don't do it then, back to what I said earlier about poverty, what happens in different countries, etc. People are wanting to eat food, and then we're there dieting and choosing to change our bodies and getting the results from that. But yet there's this sort of resentment that can come up in the bodybuilding space, but also I'd imagine, quite a lot of Gen Pop people. And this is why a lot of people will say, well, I'm not going to do that. Well, fine, if you don't want to do it, don't do it. But it's certainly back to that reframing, isn't it? The benefits you get from controlling what you put in your mouth, essentially.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, for those people who don't want to do it, if this isn't bad enough, let's take this to another level, okay? I travel a lot. I've been in 15 countries in all 50 states. I've conducted well over 200 seminars at gyms all over the world, met thousands of trainers, trained trainers, worked with lots of coaches over the years. And I work with lots of great athletes who also travel. Hafthor Bjornsson travels a lot from Iceland to wherever he's competing in his strongman competitions. Mitchell Hooper, current world's strongest man, is a client of mine. John Jones, the current heavyweight UFC champion, is a client. Lane Johnson from the Philadelphia Eagles, all-pro offensive lineman, Super Bowl champion. So I work with a lot of clients who travel quite a bit. And more recently, I've started working with the U.S. Women's Olympic Wrestling team. One wrestler in particular that just qualified for the Olympics is Kennedy Blades, a phenomenal young athlete. When I travel, I take my meals. While I'm on the airplane or when I'm planning my day to be on the flight itself, I use a Thermos. It's one of those double insulated tin, 24 ounce. On Amazon, it's called Thermos. That's the brand. And it'll keep my meals hot for 10, 12, 14 hours, depending on how hot they are when I put them in. I'll even pour boiling water into the Thermos to preheat it. And then I'll kind of somewhat overcook my food and I like to use bone broth with my mashes, my beef and rice and egg and spinach and pepper blend. That's my monster mash. If it's moist, it stays hot longer than if I just put like chicken breast or steak bits in there. That cools pretty quickly. And so I'll pack it in there super hot and put the lid on it. And I open that thing 6-8 hours later and there's steam coming in, right? Well, if I've got a short trip, I'll grab a thermos and load a meal in it and put it in my carry-on bag and I'll eat it on the plane. If I've got a long trip, flying to Podgorica was, that was a 21-hour endeavor by the time I went from New York or from Vegas to New York to Istanbul, and then to Podgorica and then through customs and to your hotel. That's a long trip. When I went to Moscow, it was the same thing. It was a 20+ hour endeavor. I actually packed 4 thermos to eat about every 3 to 4 hours. It's kind of my preference, is to eat 4 times a day, about every 4 hours. I eat a breakfast before I go. And I'll take some little snacks too, that, on the plane, little nuts, dice up some apple or take a couple of oranges and stuff like that as well. But so for the day's trip, I have all of my meals to get me wherever I need to go. And then depending on how long I'm going to be gone for, I'll take additional food. I take that in by using a meal prep company. I own my own, the Vertical Diet, where I provide meals nationwide in the US for people. So I have my own frozen meals, but you can order them from anybody. And I can just take, depending, say if it's a weekend trip and I need 4 meals for Saturday and 4 meals for Sunday as well. I fly out Friday, come home Sunday night. Then I'll just put 8 meals. I might just wrap them in a towel and put them in my checked luggage that they'll keep, for the flights, certainly any 5-6 hour flight locally in the United States. And then I stay somewhere that has a microwave and a fridge. Some places have kitchenettes, but most places have a little microwave and a fridge, and I can have my meals for the whole weekend. And that doesn't mean I won't go out, and enjoy something locally with friends if it fits my preference. But I have prepared with me what I need for the trip. Now, when I fly internationally and I'm gone for a week, I might put, 4 meals a day times 5-6 days. I might put 20, 24, sometimes, more meals. I'll put them into a rolling Coleman cooler, one of those insulated coolers, and I'll duct tape that shut and I'll check it onto the plane like a regular checked bag. And now I have all my food for the whole week. And if I wake up in the morning and I have to do a seminar that day, and it's that might be a 6-8 hour day between doing the seminar and going to the gym and showing people how to lift, etc. I wake up in the morning and I eat my breakfast, which is a prep meal. I heat up 2 more and I put them into thermos and I take them with me. Now I've got meals to get me all the way to dinner, and my whole day is, easily taken care of in terms of my food. I took meals to Podgorica with me for the whole week. And I came rolling in there with my rolling Coleman cooler, going to customs. And of course, the guy at customs is like, and everybody's packing in there, right, together. It's not very organized. Podgorica is a tiny little airport, and everybody's just massing in there. And this guy he picks me out of the crowd. It's not like I blend in very well, and I've got my cooler. And he's like, "What is that?" I'm going to do a terrible accent imitation, but he said it in English, but with, and I said, "It's food." And everybody looked at me, and he's like, "Oh no, you," and he's, they'd like to gesticulate a lot. And so his arms are waving like this, and the whole situation is just getting out of hand. And he's like, "Come over here, come over here." And so I take sheepishly trying to squeeze my shoulders together, not to be too obvious, right? I walk over with my cooler, and he says, "You cannot have food. Give me your passport." So I give him my passport. He looks at it and he goes, "Oh, you Americans." And he hands me my passport back and he says, "Get out of here." And he let me keep my food. He just told me to go throw it away or just leave. He's all mad at me. Switzerland did take my food. They would not let me bring it in. And the little girl who checked me through customs looked at me and she goes, "You really should consider going vegan." And I'm like, I don't want to get shipped back out of there. And so I'm just like, yes, ma'am. But you do need to check and see. Now, I tell this to all of my clients, particularly Kennedy Blades, because she travels internationally a lot to wrestle in countries that possibly don't have the same particularly South America, where it's a little more difficult to get food that might not have some local bacteria that we're not accustomed to. Anyhow, she did not take her food to a wrestling competition. It's been about 8 months ago. And sure enough, she ended up in the hospital with food poisoning because she ate local food. And I commonly hear that amongst the strongmen who travel internationally, because they'll eat local food there, that they'll end up getting some sort of digestive distress, and they, for lack of a better term, they'll piss out their ass for 3 or 4 days, and they'll lose 10 or 12 pounds. And that has a huge impact on performance. Kennedy, who was expected to win that tournament, she was going to get a gold there, ended up with a bronze and ended up in the hospital. But it's just an example, especially for those people who performance is an objective for the travel. Take the meals with you, drink bottled water when you're there, and be very careful, because it could have a huge impact on your performance. So that might frustrate people who don't want to go to this level of of detail just to get food, but it can be hugely important and necessary, obviously, for your goals if you're a competitive athlete.
Yeah, well, this is the big thing, isn't it? What's appropriate to your goals? And, of course, we get people say, I'll do whatever it takes. And then when it comes to it, they don't do whatever it takes. And this is across the board, with all sports, even Gen Pop, people are invested in what the physique outcome will potentially be, but what gets you to that physique outcome? And ordinarily, I really like how you said it earlier about if you're changing your life, that these are habits we're building, new habits, everything's changing and geared towards a goal, but what happens after that? But if we've built in these routines and rituals, maybe you even enjoy it, then you're more likely to, of course, continue this as you move forward. And this is where it's quite difficult sometimes with the bodybuilding competing and the preps. People do get into this sport without maybe the full overview as to what's expected from a prep, right? It's like, well, it's a diet. We know it's far more than that. It's a diet plus some. You're looking at, it's not a normal place to be when you're stage lean. But then, unfortunately, I don't know if you come across this, but some coaches in the space, they will ignore the sort of signs of potentially food disorders or ways of habits and things that happen. They ignore that to get the outcome of the show for the client. What happens to that client when they're off the back of that show? And we know what happens, right? And it really, it upsets me, Stan, because it's like, where's that duty of care? If you're noticing signs of food pathologies, disordered way of thinking, and you ignore it, it's not due diligence. But of course, it happens.
Well, let's talk about that, because I've been coaching bodybuilder, figure, physique, bikini athletes since the early 90s for competition, up to including at a pro level. Women in particular, worked with a lot of women throughout my career. Nadia Wyatt, 3rd place Miss Olympia, 2nd in the Arnold Classic. Fantastic client to work with. But women in particular, because they're more disciplined, because they're smaller and eat fewer calories, will often suffer more from this process than men, who are more apt to overeat, more apt to cheat on their diets. And women will compound the dietary restriction with lack of sleep and excess cardio. They'll do all three. And women will commonly suffer from what we come to know as the female triad, where they'll end up with this chronic calorie restriction resulting in amenorrhea, a cessation of the menstrual period, and then osteopenia. They'll start to see some bone mineral density loss. And that could be particularly concerning with women who compete, say, in distance running type of activities, because they end up with shin splints. And I think we saw that most famously with the Nike female runners just within the last couple of years. There was a big dust up and maybe even a lawsuit regarding the over restriction, the hyper focus on weight, on body weight, on the scale weight. In the United States, in the IFBB NPC, I think Sandy Rinaldi has been around for, I want to say, damn near 30 plus 40 years in this industry. She runs with Jim Mannion. Used to be, I think she runs with Jim Mannion. She runs the women's NPC. And I've listened to her present at dozens, if not 100 shows over the years. And she'll say to all of the women who are competing, look, if you want to make a significant, if you want to get better and get better placings, you've got to stop just looking at the scale. If you want to change your physique, you need to increase your lean muscle mass. So that you can't just keep getting skinnier and skinnier and lighter and expect to get better placings. And so I think she's giving the right message. Now, the people that are dieting others for those shows, I call them the guru dieters. And there's a couple of them in the United States who over the years have been very popular, and they've helped thousands of girls get ready for shows. So I use the word help somewhat cautiously. And I kind of called them out about 10 years ago, and I even talked about it in my Iceland seminar. If anybody wants to tune into one of my seminars, I spend over 2 hours going through slides step by step up at Hafþór Björnsson's gym in Iceland. And it's very popular, almost 7 million views now on that. But I talked about guru diets and the over-restrictive nature of feeding these women egg whites, tilapia, broccoli, a scoop of almond butter, and then demonizing red meat, dairy, egg yolks, fruit, salt, all the things that are necessary for their general health. Egg yolks because of biotin in particular, which is for your skin, hair, and nails. We commonly see women prep for shows and end up with really brittle hair. And then the chronic calorie restriction and the female triad ultimately results in hypothyroidism, and that hair starts to fall out. It's tragic. Things like dairy for calcium. And now the type of dairy would be dependent on the individual's tolerance for lactose, which is variable, which is like a low-fat Greek yogurt would be much more tolerable than, say, a milk. And then even a cheddar cheese, a hard cheese, has almost no lactose in it. And there's lactose-free foods now. Fairlife has lactose-free dairy. But it's for the calcium in particular, which is hugely important. I mentioned osteopenia, bone mineral density loss with women in the female triad. Red meat for the iron. I mean, we see anemia, commonly see anemia in these chronic dieters and in athletes. I was working with a female softball team. Do I need to say female softball? I'm probably not. It's one and the same. Working with a softball team, a high school softball team a couple years ago in Arizona. And we test their performance metrics on a regular basis to make sure that they're progressing. And we'll use a laser timed 40 at least once a month, if it's not a broad jump, something that we can actually measure and test their strength or their ability to perform. So 2 of the girls had significantly declined in their 40 times. And so we talked to the parents, what's going on? They want to see, sleep, stress, whatever else. And they said they've been really tired lately, just fatigued, very common in high school girls. And so I asked them to get a blood test. And sure enough, they were anemic. Both of them were. And so we employed a protocol to get them sufficient iron. But they, because of diet culture, were demonizing a host of foods, as mentioned with these guru diets, red meat being one of those. And red meat isn't one thing. There's a whole, continuum of red meats. Some, as we talked earlier, like a lean top sirloin steak is going to be much lower in saturated fat than, say, a ribeye, if that's a concern. And so understand that I'm talking about eating lean red meats for the iron and the zinc and the B vitamins, all those things that are necessary for performance, particularly in a calorie deficit. Fruit is another one, which is fantastic. People are always talking about, well, there's sugar and fructose and all this alarmism, which is totally unnecessary. Fruits are fantastic, particularly low sugar fruits, the blueberries, the raspberries, the strawberries, the oranges, very satiating, very high in fiber. Raspberries are very high in fiber, 5 grams of fiber per serving. And then salt as well, sodium. A lot of these girls, as mentioned, and we'll talk about this next, tend to do a ton of cardio and sweat a lot intentionally thinking that sweating burns fat, which is not the case. And it's not just women. I'll have men come in with their plastic suits on, and then they go into the sauna thinking they're sweating away fat, or that somehow they sweat out toxins, neither of which is true. It's just totally unnecessary, and it just compromises your health. But and then their coaches won't have them add back any salt. They're eating no processed foods, no fast foods, which is a good thing. But there's not much salt in a lot of these foods that they're making. And so you're going to need to add back in salt, particularly if you're sweating a lot, because you sweat out sodium. And that's going to be very important for performance. It's also important for keeping your muscles hydrated to look full. And that's, for these fitness competitors, that's a very important piece, is the look. And so, I've experienced a lot of that, and I came out pretty hard against that and specifically named a couple of these companies. And sure enough, it wasn't within a year or two later. It takes them a long time. Yeah. Their diet started including lean red meats, a piece of fruits, one whole egg. You do an egg white blend, yogurt. I started seeing all of these things pop up in the diets, and it's good to see some movement in the industry, but there's always going to be people that think that over restriction is going to lead to better results. And just really quickly on the exercise side, and this goes for competitors as well as general public, a relatively small portion of the fat that you lose comes from how do I phrase this? Because exercise is important for the heart. You do burn calories when you exercise, but more exercise has diminishing returns, is what I can say. That it's not just a more is better scenario, and it can have a suppressing effect on thyroid, on testosterone, on sleep, all of these things. You can over-exercise. It's much more effective to be very consistent and disciplined in controlling your caloric intake, the energy intake side of the equation, than the energy expenditure side. And you can focus more on what's called non-exercise activity, which I'm certain you've discussed, many times on your show with people. When I get a client that's already at, God forbid, 1,400 calories, a day, and doing 2 50-minute cardio sessions, one in the morning, one at night, which prompts me to say, if you're waking up at 4 a.m. after only 5 hours of sleep to do cardio, you're stepping over $100 bills to pick up nickels, because loss of sleep is also a huge contributor to insulin resistance, hunger signaling, lean muscle tissue loss. You need that 7+ hours, particularly in a prep when you're training hard. But if you're already doing 50 minutes twice a day of cardio, and you're already, restricted down to 1,400 calories, God forbid. I have a 121-pound bikini competitor eating 2,700 calories a day. That's where I'd like people to be, is in that 2,000+ range and still losing weight. And she only does 3 10-minute walks a day, one after each meal, for cardio. I have her burn calories, increase her energy expenditure by doing 2 a day weightlifting workouts, which I think is more specific to their goal. And these aren't long, grueling workouts. These are just stimulus. But I have her stay on her feet all day. I have her get her 10,000 steps, and I don't let her sit down. And that has a huge impact for non-exercise activity, which burns 3 times as many calories on average as an actual exercise activity, a designed bout of exercise, because you can stay on your feet all day long. And that's about all that's left by the time I get to, because a client usually comes to me 30 days before a show, and they're falling apart and nothing's, and they want fixed real quick. And that's usually a year-long battle is what that is. But in that short time period, to rescue what's going on, I'll diversify the micronutrients there a little bit, get more sleep, but I'll have them stay on their feet all day long. Just don't sit down, not one time, and that can be kind of grueling after a while. And that's precisely why more exercise has a diminishing returns, does not equal more weight loss, as in terms of the time invested in the return on that investment, is because of what we call compensation. And you go in and you train really hard, and then you come home and you sit more and eat more. And that has a huge impact. You can always overeat the number of calories that you burn in a training session. That's pretty easy to do. And that's generally what happens, even and specifically with the general population, when you try and introduce, as we mentioned with the earlier, you don't want to set them up for failure by creating this diet plan they're not going to adhere to. The same is true of exercise. And that's kind of why I start with the 10-minute walks, because they're so simple to do. Get up in the morning, take a 10-minute walk. After each meal, take a 10-minute walk. That gets you your 30 minutes a day, your 210 minutes a week, which exceeds the American Heart Association's recommendation for 150 minutes of cardio a week. And we do see in the literature that 3 10-minute walks a day is better than 1 30-minute bout of exercise at the end of the day for glycemic control, for cardiovascular fitness. The frequency seems to have an added benefit. And they're easier to comply with, and you can do them anywhere, anytime. There's barriers to entry to getting dressed, getting in your car, driving to the gym, putting your 40 minutes in on the unbelievably boring treadmill or elliptical. Nobody's inclined to do that for a long period of time. That's the first thing that they're like, it's not enjoyable. So I always say the best exercise is the one you'll do. And if you like playing pickleball, or if you like, whatever it is that you enjoy doing, do that. That's your exercise. And then throw in a little bit of resistance training, and hopefully a good coach can teach you how to do that. So that's also enjoyable, because not too many people, like, we love to train. And I don't presume to think that everybody loves to train. And so I tell them they need to train, but let's find some exercises that they enjoy, because there's no one best exercise. They're all just tools. I do like to get a little axial loading for the bone mineral density of the spine, but you can do that in any number of ways. Other than that, if you just find a few machines that you enjoy and go in there and chit chat and do a little resistance and try and get somewhat close to failure, in and out in 20, 30 minutes, twice, maybe 3 times a week at most, it's a sufficient stimulus to retain and maybe even gain lean muscle mass, and something that should be done forever, so you should find not only a venue that you like to go to, but an exercise program, a resistance program that you enjoy doing.
So much resonates with me and things I come across within the bodybuilding space, as it were, particularly where you're talking about, over restriction and a very low selection of foods. And you're almost describing my early days of being a bikini athlete. And I was essentially scared to put on weight, and then I'm chasing the scale weight in a prep. And a message I always share, particularly recently, I did a podcast and it was like over 2 hours long about scale weight. And, of course, there is some categories that are in a weight cap, right? But other than that, why are coaches using scale weight as a vector of progress, as the main vector of progress, and not looking at physique shots? Like it doesn't correlate with bodybuilding. Now, like I say, it is a vector of, progress and what's going on, but why aren't we using those physique shots to gear what's happening? And, when you talk about scale weight and that emotional attachment, it sounds like you've come across it as well. It's not just females, it's males as well. And it is, it's like this, we called it scale weight fuckery, the episode, because, this number you stand, your whole day is consumed by what that number says. Now, we know, Stan, a lot of things affect scale weight, and that's not just food, that's stress, recovery, exercise itself, all of these things. And I feel it's our job as coaches or people in the space of influence to help our community understand that. But it seems over the years it's got worse and worse, not just coaches that coach by scale weight, but there's a lot of limiting beliefs around the scale weight as a measure. I'm sure you'll agree.
I do, and you're right, it does take some education. We do know that which gets measured gets improved, and the vast majority of successful dieters do have some metrics by which they measure. But just as you have to become educated about calories without long-term subjecting yourself to having to weigh and measure everything that you eat, it just helps you understand where the big pitfalls are, or the heavy calorie dense foods are. I had a young lady that worked at my company for a while, would come in every morning with a vanilla latte for Starbucks. Didn't realize there was 700 calories in the vanilla latte. So, I mean, just little things, just awareness, at least for 30 days, track everything that you eat just so you can understand where the pitfalls are. And I'm sure you discussed this on your episode, but it's not the daily scale weight because it fluctuates so dramatically, particularly for women. I mean, just a hard leg day and an extra 50 grams of carbs is going to cause some inflammation, some water and glycogen storage in the muscles. Just food bulk, eating more fiber is going to cause more water into the large intestine. But also, if you're going to weigh, you should weigh every day and then take the average for the week and compare it to the next week's average. That's a better way. But look, I live in reality. My wife is Samoan, born and raised in Samoa. Samoan folks are notorious for struggling with their weight. And so I have a lifelong dieter here in my home who, yes, her mood is determined by the scale. And if she works really hard on being very disciplined about her diet for a period of time and the scale doesn't move the way she wants, that's extremely disheartening and frustrating, which is why we do the before and after pictures. And I have example of those on that same Iceland seminar. The scale doesn't tell the whole story. Get a waist measurement. When I'm helping chronic dieters recover from that, which is a lot of what we do, and it's hard because you can tell them this process takes a long time. It does. To gain back all the muscle that you lost, to get comfortable with gaining weight because you want to gain muscle. That's very hard for a lot of people. But if they're patient and are willing to go through the process, then ultimately they can end up where some of my other clients end up, where they're eating 2,500 calories a day and still staying very lean. But that process is best measured using strength. That's my favorite metric. Let's focus on getting strong right now. Let's not weigh and let's not obsess over the scale. Let's get sufficient protein. Let's work on our training stimulus and use evidence-based hypertrophy guidelines. And I think a lot of, well, hopefully, I don't want to make any broad statements, but it's been my experience that women will cross a lot of T's and dot a lot of I's. They'll work hard, but not necessarily very effectively for hypertrophy. They'll do a lot of volume, but is it effective volume? I see a lot of junk volume where they'll do 10 reps, but they could have done 15.
Yeah.
And that's not a sufficient stimulus. It's a lot of work, burns some calories. It's okay for maintenance. But if they really want to grow muscle, and usually when you say the word build muscle, they equate that to getting bigger.
Yeah.
And don't realize that the muscle, a comparative pound of muscle versus a pound of fat, is actually much smaller, and it gives you the shape. It makes those knees dive in as opposed to it gives you the shape that you're looking for, that even though there isn't such a thing as a glute hamstring tie-in necessarily, but they understand that's the separation that you see from a tight muscle against another tight muscle, as opposed to the fat causing a blurring of that area. You'll start to see lines. That all happens with muscle, as mentioned earlier with Sandy Rinaldi and her discussions with the bikini athletes. And so we focus, that's what I like to measure. And it's very rewarding. I do that with beginners too. Particularly, it's kind of a cheat that I do. If I get a client that's just starting out weight training, I'll put them on a trap bar deadlift because it's easy to teach, and they'll progress very fast. Yeah. Whatever they can deadlift the first day, the next week they'll come in, they'll be able to lift at least 1 or 2 more repetitions there, if not already 10 or 20 more pounds. Let's throw a dime on each side, right? And they're like, oh my God, I'm getting stronger already. And you and I both know that's neural adaptation. They're just getting a little better at the movements, a little more coordinated, learning to recruit the muscles necessary, and learning a little more about effort, how hard they can actually try. And that happens for many, many, many weeks. That can go on for 8, 12 longer weeks. They'll get stronger every single workout. The neural adaptation, usually, depending on the rate of learning of the individual and their experience, that usually lasts 30 to 45 days, maybe, before they've learned the movement sufficiently to where they're, able to perform it. And then beyond that, measuring strength is a direct indicator of lean mass growth, or certainly retention. That's what I measure with my bikini and figure girls who diet. I'm focused mostly on strength retention. And even if volume's compromised, even if they can't get 12 or 14 sets per body part, which I never recommend to begin with anyhow, anything north of 6 or 8 is probably beyond that, which is going to provide you any additional benefit. I'd rather increase frequency at that point rather than volume in any given workout. But they'll no longer be able to train for a full hour without getting tired. I'm okay with 25 to 35 minutes, so long as the intensity I define that as the load, the amount of weight that they can lift, and the effort getting to within a rep or two of failure. As long as I keep those high, they're going to retain their muscle tissue before competition. It was one of the things that Nadia Wyatt, who also competes in powerlifting, was so happy about, is that she was stronger longer going into a show. She didn't have this precipitous decline in strength, even though I cautioned her a couple months out that volume is going to start to slowly, you're going to get a little more tired during the workout. And we throw psychological strategies at that. Getting tired during the workouts is largely psychological. Some of anaerobic training is certainly glycogen, having sufficient glycogen to perform the movement. Creatine also helps. Those are the substrates that you use to actually do those anaerobic movements. Central nervous system recovery starts to get more and more compromised the closer you get to competition. So you might even need longer rest periods. Yeah. Because each subsequent set, if you don't give yourself adequate time for your central nervous system to recover, and I'm thinking somewhere north of 2 minutes possibly, depending on if it's a multi-joint, axial loading movement as compared to a bicep curl, you might only need 60 seconds. But I think that most women pre-contest in particular try and turn that stimulus, that hypertrophy stimulus, into a fat burning session or a cardio session. And it's not the same thing. It's not ideal for either, to be honest. And so I try and focus mostly on hypertrophy and keep the heavier loads in longer, let them rest a little longer between sets so that their central nervous system is recovered sufficiently, so they don't see this huge decline between the first and second set, the number of reps they can perform with that particular weight. The huge declines are indicative of a lack of either substrate replenishment, which would be creatine and maybe what am I thinking, lactate or hydrogen ion buildup. You get that burn. That's not necessarily a driver of hypertrophy. It's a passenger. But the mechanical tension and the ability to continue to give maximal effort. And that's another reason why I don't do 4 sets of a particular exercise. I might do 2, because you can invest a lot into 2. By the time I do 4 sets of a particular exercise, I start to see people saving themselves for the 3rd or 4th set, and they won't invest as much into the 1st and 2nd. And that stimulus is the single most important thing. Getting sufficient sleep, having sufficient calories, psychologically being prepared, because that is the thing that will grow or allow a decline in lean mass, if not sufficient, because your body, it knows what it needs to super compensate from. If the stimulus is declining over time, even though you're working hard, it's not a comparable load or volume to what you were doing previously. So it's not going to grow muscle, and the muscle might even decline. So we saw this in Stu Phillips' lab up at McMaster University when he cut protein in half for one group of people. I think he did 1.6 grams per pound for one group, and he did 0.8 grams per pound for the other group in terms of protein intake. And he presumed that the group with the 50% of the protein intake would have a big decline in muscle tissue, but he trained them both very hard, and they retained their muscle similarly. So eating more protein doesn't just automatically give you more muscle. It's certainly the substrate that helps build muscle. You need a sufficient amount of it, but in the absence of the stimulus is much more important than the amount of protein. I don't care if you eat, 4 grams per pound, or it's not going to be any better than 1 gram per pound, or not be any better than 0.5 grams per pound, presuming the stimulus, this training stimulus, is sufficient. So it really comes down to the work, and there's no the way to biohack that.
Yeah, you'd be maybe a billionaire if you could biohack that, Stan. I think as well,
Yeah.
a good point as an expansion from that as well is that not only do people go into a diet or a prep and think automatically, shit, my training's going to go downhill. And the conversation I have, you know, putting it quite literally, you still have plenty of body fat, you still have plenty of energy, you've been in a calorie surplus for an extended period of time. When you flip that switch and you go into a diet, the mindset doesn't need to change there. You still continue with that mindset throughout this period. Now, of course, we get to a point in a prep in particular where we need to auto-regulate more, and you know, maybe your injury risk is higher and things like this. But you know, there is that fine line then as a coach where it's like, okay, so we're leading up to the peak week, you know, we're getting lower and lower in body fat. Something I do see a lot is either clients going gun-ho in a peak week and they're still trying to train like a savage and do the cardio, etc., or perhaps the coach is driving them to continue training really, really hard in that crucial week. Now, I know myself, and I know through other professionals, other people that I've come across, that actually, generally speaking, in a peak week, should be ready before that, right? And then that peak week is, you know, as much R&R as possible, maybe some pump sessions, and enjoying that week leading up to the show. And it'd be interested to have your insight there, because, you know, bodybuilders that are listening, that have the preference to push through a peak week and be that savage in the gym with all the plates aside, or maybe their coach is prescribing that, what would your sort of advice be around that peak week time?
Let me put a note on that peak week. I'm going to hit on that second. I realized as I was talking, I was trying to calculate grams per pound and grams per kilogram, and because your audience is kilogram, and I misspoke. I said 1.6 grams per pound. It's 1.6 grams per kilogram is the higher end of the protein recommendation that will provide probably a maximum muscle protein synthesis benefit for lean mass retention or growth. That's what most of the science seems to suggest now, about 0.8 grams per pound or 1.6 grams per kilogram. Now, if you go higher, that doesn't mean that it's going to get converted to fat. There's a number, it's very difficult actually for protein to get converted to fat. It's much more likelihood that your fat would get stored as fat faster. There are some reasons you could go higher in protein. One would be satiety. It tends to keep you full longer. And the other would be the thermic effect of food. You could eat just more volume of protein and net out fewer total calories. For every 100 grams of protein you consume, you only net out about 70, 75 of that in calories. Or every 100 calories of protein you consume, you only net out about 70 or 75. Because the thermic effect, your body burns calories metabolizing protein, burns more calories metabolizing protein than it does metabolizing fats or carbs. So I wanted to clarify that so people aren't confused. 1.6 grams per kilogram seems to be where people have settled in. The evidence-based, the credentialed researchers, Stu Phillips being, one of the people that I looked from McMaster University, does a lot of this research and has for over 30 years. Along with the International Society of Sports Nutrition, Jose Antonio, the president of that, he's done overfeeding studies up to 4 grams per kilogram of protein, 2 grams per pound, and hasn't found an increase in body fat or in lean mass as a result. You get similar benefits. So I wanted to clarify that. And really quickly hit on macros, because we talked a lot about food. We talked about calories being king and having to maintain a calorie deficit to lose weight. And then you mentioned proteins, fats, and carbs. I'll just tell you how I design it and why for performance. Okay. The evidence shows us that when you control for calories and protein, where you put fats and carbs does not matter for weight loss. It's personal preference. Which one keeps you satiated? Which one's easier for you to adhere to long-term? There's plenty of randomized controlled trials, the Stanford trial, the Diet Fits trial. It's over 600 people they tracked for a year with different carbohydrate and fat intakes. As long as calories are equated and protein, that's important, because on a lot of the keto diets where they say they're superior to high carb diets, they aren't equating for protein. And generally when you go keto, you're eating more protein because you're eating a lot more meat. But if you equate for protein and calories, where you put fats and carbs does not seem to matter. It doesn't matter for glycemic control either. That was also studied in these tests. So, but for performance, I'll give you some metrics. Again, 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight is a good place to set your protein to start.
Yeah.
You may eat more after we've figured out what your other macros are, depending on how many calories. Different athletes have different calorie allotments in order to maintain a deficit. And the total calories will kind of determine what I'm going to say next. I like to reduce fats for this reason, because carbohydrates both optimize the anaerobic training. They improve your training sessions. You can do one more set, one more rep, just have more energy to invest into training. And that, as mentioned, becomes kind of the primary driver of your results. Also, they have more opportunity to be utilized for energy, liver glycogen, and muscle glycogen prior to being utilized as stored as fat. So I prefer to start to bring my fats down. I think I want to say it was Eric Trexler with Mass Research Reviews. I believe he's, sometimes I confuse these Erics, but PhD nutrition and pro natural bodybuilder. And I may have the wrong Eric. It's escaping me right now. But he did a kind of a compilation of the research to show that as long as you're getting about 60 grams of fats a day, and that's pretty low, and you may even be able to go lower than that, you won't compromise hormones, sleep, micronutrient absorption, A, D, E, and K, the fat-soluble vitamins. And that would kind of be my bottom end, right around 60 grams of fats. I would gradually get there over the course of the diet as I decreased calories. I'd want to keep as many carbs in. Now, carbs are the rest. So I said I'm going to put 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. And then I'm going to eat 60 grams of fats a day. Those are fixed numbers. And then I have to figure out how many calories that you can eat and still maintain a deficit to lose weight. And the rest, in quotes, become carbohydrates. And, obviously you want to use more fibrous, slower metabolizing carbohydrate, more satiating carbohydrates for most of those meals. And then maybe pre and post workout, you could throw in some faster carbs if that helped you with your performance bout. Particularly if you're going to train twice a day. This becomes very important. If you're training twice a day, and most of my competitors do, because as mentioned, I'd rather have them do a training session, spend 25 minutes doing hamstrings and side delts, than doing 40 minutes on a treadmill. I'd much rather, because the hamstrings and side delts actually contribute to what we're trying to do, building muscle, whereas the cardio does not, obviously. But if you're going to train twice a day, after the first workout, you're going to want to replenish what you're going to need for the second workout, which is you're going to sweat out some water, you're going to have lost some sodium, and you're going to have lost some glycogen. And so I will give them immediately post-workout, and this isn't a protein, what we used to call that, the window, post-workout window where we always thought you had to have the anabolic window where you had to have your 40 grams of protein or whatever, your sleep away. Although a little bit of protein with that, probably a whey isolate in particular, with those carbs actually helps uptake them a little faster, along with the water and the sodium. And so, and it helps reduce the muscle tissue breakdown and help restore the central nervous system. So the subsequent workout is, you perform better if you can restore that sooner. Okay. If you're only going to train once a day, it doesn't matter. Whatever you eat throughout the next 24 hours is going to restore your glycogen and your sodium and your water. It's normal course of business. And so that's how I design my macros for competitive people in particular. And then, like you mentioned, when you get down to peak week, some of the big things I'm concerned about is sleep loss, fatigue. So I might minimize axial loading and I might minimize just the total load. I might take out I don't do a lot of deadlifts and squats for bodybuilders pre-contest anyhow, so fatiguing. I'd rather have, leg presses and extensions and curls, and it's just less load, less axial loading, less total weight, less fatigue. I can give them more volume and frequency that way, because the fatigue it's a finite resource. And then, obviously I'm mostly posing that week, and trying to give their legs at least a few days to recover from the last decent workout, so that they can show more definition, get the glycogen back into the muscle. I'm cautious to overprescribe peak week, because I think people try and manipulate a whole bunch of variables to make a 1% improvement, and they end up going 5% backwards. Sure. Is most commonly what happens. They for the longest time there, the keto folks they'd go to Burger King and get a big cheeseburger and fries, and they'd come backstage and they'd be like, look, and they'd show you their forearms were all popping with veins, right? But then they pull their shirt up and their belly was hanging out, because the burger and fries and salt and water, and plus it's a huge departure from anything that they had been eating for many weeks or months. And that's a great way to mess your system up, is to eat a bunch of stuff that you haven't been eating. And so I like to do as little as possible the last week. If I'm going to do a restriction, it'll be 20%. And if I'm going to do a load, it'll be 20% north or south of what their maintenance level was going into that. And I like to keep a little salt and a little sugar in there, and carbs, because that's the muscles have a fuller effect. Yeah. And there's a particular concentration that helps the sodium glucose transporter from the small intestine into the bloodstream. There's a particular concentration that helps facilitate that optimally, opposed to spilling over, as we would say. But too much sugar or too much salt or just too much water isn't the most efficient way. And so we try and make sure that's optimal, so the body can get those nutrients where they want to go most efficiently without spilling over.
Yeah, for sure. And then on the other end of the spectrum, of course, on stage pretty flat. And, you've got those two sides of the coin, and peaks can go wrong very, very easily. It's that time as a coach to learn the physique, of course, is invaluable. And what's nice is if you can work with a client before a prep in an ideal situation, if possible, having that period of time to understand what their maintenance is, what their surplus is, and having that data as well. Now, I think as well, in that sort of probably the 48-hour window before the show, that's where things can potentially go wrong. And, with flattening off, is the recovery and the stress management there on that whole week really leading up to it? And then are you able to fill an athlete up enough so that you can see those rounded muscle bellies and looking nice and full? And that is a very, very fine line for some athletes. And of course, it's the coach's job to try and manage that and do what they can. If it is the first peak, I would say that there is that sort of, communication from the coach's standpoint to say, this is our first time peaking together. You've got to trust the process, as it were, and we will do our best. And if you can consequently work with a coach for years, this is the best scenario, as it were. But with that flattening off, it can be very hard to revive a physique, right?
Yeah, once you spill over, it's hard to recover from that. Couple of things. Everybody's different. There's no best protocol. And only through experience, and carefully tracking what you did. I like to, 2 weeks out, 3 weeks out, I like to kind of run through
practice,
a trial run, and see kind of how they respond, whether they improve or what have you to a carbohydrate sodium load. And then again, I don't introduce any new foods to them the last couple of days. That's a bad idea. And every time you eat your carbohydrates on the load, I like to have access. The muscles that you use will preferentially absorb that glycogen. So we do these little, I hate to even call them workouts, but after a meal, you'll want to, whether it's a rowing machine or just little pumps for each of the body parts. We do a full body pump, and we might do that 3 times a day for 2 straight days. We might.
Yeah.
We'll certainly do it, 2 nights before and 1 night before. Absolutely. But every time you eat carbohydrates the last couple of days, I like to move. Helps with digestion, of course, as well. You got to be careful with the fiber intake, because women in particular, they'll carry a lot of that in the lower intestine, and they'll think that they'll start to have that little pooch come out, and understand that part of that's your uterus. It's not going away.
Yes, I had to learn this.
Yeah. But the fiber is one thing that we can manipulate, is to reduce the fiber gradually over the last few days to get that large intestine to kind of flatten out.
Yeah.
And again, the titration of the fluids that you drink, so that you don't have too much fluid accumulating in the intestines. Although it passes through relatively quickly, it's still that little teeny bit of bloating below the belly button. Women, they'll definitely hyperfixate on that, and so there are some things we can do.
Yeah, for sure. I love that you mentioned fiber, because it is important. I always have this. So over my years of competing, I have this, like, with my fitness pal, and I input my peak macros and keep it to very, very simple foods. Like, guys, listen, we're not fucking around here. Just keep it simple. But the idea for me is to get the fiber pretty much as low as possible for those last couple of days in particular. And then on show day, it is just those very, very simple foods. But I think that sometimes there is an element of this emotional attachment to, wow, I've got so much more food here on the carb load. I can experiment with different foods here, and include foods I haven't had for ages, or maybe not keeping track of the fiber. But we know what happens to the physique if the fiber is too high, and it is a bit weird, because everything's very minimal. It's like maybe a banana and some rice, some rice cakes and jam, and it's like, where's my healthy foods gone? But it's that crucial time. It's super important. You've got to be not emotionally led, because the show is the focus, the physique, not what food you want to maybe have, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's temporary. I've said that health and fitness are not the same thing, and health is the free from illness or injury. And I always say, show me somebody who's never been injured, I'll show you somebody who's never won anything.
Yeah, I love that
But
saying.
fitness is the ability to perform a particular duty or task, and it's for a very brief time there, whether it's the 2 days before with respect to fiber, or it's a month or two before in terms of the amount of hard work and the calorie restriction that you're doing. Those are intended to be temporary to achieve a particular goal.
For sure.
And so long as you're not straying too far outside of compromising your health, which often happens when I've got strong men, over 400 pounds, who have to get ready for a world's strongest man. There's some times at which you just bite the leather, and you get in there to win, and there's compromises to be made. Hopefully we don't do that year round. We talked about that in terms of women in particular. It's not the kind of condition that you should even attempt to sustain. Nor do I want my strongmen and powerlifters and offensive linemen in football to stay as heavy as they are all year round. They should lose some weight, periodize their training, and lose some body fat and get healthy. So yeah, all those things are important. I would throw in here that kind of a good guide, if you want to keep as much fiber in as long as possible, then I transition to the low FODMAP, FODMAP, fermentable oligodimmonosaccharides and polyols. Again, not a prescription for long-term dietary pattern, but the lower FODMAP foods create less gas in the bowel. They're less fermentable. And that would be avoiding things like raw broccoli, things like sugar alcohols, things that cause a lot of gas and bloating. And you can just Google FODMAP, and there's a whole host of different menus that'll come up. Monash University out of Australia is the one that that does most of the research, and we'll kind of give you a list of foods that are less gassy and a list of foods that are more gassy. Not a good food, bad food conversation, right? It's just, here's where I should lean into these during this time frame. so that I don't have as much bloating. And it's also very individualistic, and you should, obviously garlic and onions can be culprits for creating a lot of gas and bloating, although they can be very healthy foods. So, it's not the conversation. And so people, I think it's part of why the over restriction occurs is that certain foods may affect people's digestion, and then they'll equate those to be bad foods. But they're dose dependent. How they're prepared matters, and it can be cumulative in nature. If sometimes you can handle a certain serving of oats 2 days in a row, but the third day, all of a sudden you're like, well, it's not the oats because I was fine Monday and Tuesday, but now all of a sudden they can be cumulative in nature because your bacteria in your gut responds to the amount of these foods that you eat, and they start to grow in quantity. And when they reach a particular density, then it may start kind of causing you some gas and bloating.
Yeah, for sure. Because the last one we want on stage, Stan, is of course a nice bloated potbelly, which does happen. And the thing is, and the big message there is, if you're listening, guys, and you're getting close to a peak week, that is a time where you really need to stay in your lane, not worrying about what everyone else is eating and what everyone else is doing. What your coach is saying. Hopefully, guys, you have a good coach. But those guidelines are there for a reason. These protocols are certainly there for a reason. Now, before we wrap up, Stan, I've got 3 questions, but I don't know if we're gonna fit them in your day, because one of them is quite a hefty one. But we've had so much to talk about. I'm like, we could talk for hours, Stan.
I know.
So there's 2 fairly easy ones. One's very easy. Now, you actually touched on it earlier. I had, from our question box I put on Instagram, sugar-free drinks, and that was the only context. Now, you touched on it can be a bit of a now, I don't have a problem with sugar-free drinks. It doesn't sound like you have when you mentioned it earlier. I don't have any other context, but I'm guessing is it okay to have them is probably the question.
Yeah, boy, I tell you, this is such an emotional topic. It's been really hot lately. People making all sorts of claims, particularly because IARC, the research arm of the World Health Organization, classified them as a class 2B carcinogen. But people don't understand that that they don't determine dose. And as with everything, the dose makes the poison. I don't drink diet sodas. I don't lead with them for my clients' diets, but I recognize, that they're pretty innocuous. We've got tons of human trials showing that the alarmism over causing cancer or what have you is unnecessary and unhelpful, because with reasonable consumption, there's just no evidence that they do cause cancer. But we do have evidence to show that when you replace sugar-laden beverages with diet sodas, we see an improvement in weight loss and all the things that are associated with weight loss, because ultimately the goal for the vast majority of people who suffer from prediabetes and diabetes and overweight and obesity, the weight loss is the primary driver of health benefits, irrespective of diet. I qualify that by saying I'm pretty particular about the foods that I want people to eat for a host of other reasons. Sufficient protein, sufficient micronutrients, satiety, all of those things are very important to consider when doing a diet. But the weight loss itself, as we've seen with the McDonald's diet and the Twinkie diet and the 7-Eleven diet, will result in an improvement in all the biomarkers. Even high saturated fat keto diets, which can, for some people, lead to elevated LDL and ApoB and potentially increased cardiovascular disease risk. With weight loss, you see an improvement in lipid markers, at least initially. You see a reduction in blood pressure. You see an improvement in blood sugars. All of those things are good. And even cancer risk. Here's what's interesting about diet sodas. There's some folks who would suggest that the IARC's classification means that it can increase cancer risk, although the evidence of that is small, and again, it's dose dependent, and through animal studies with hyperconsumption. What is that risk? What is that increased cancer risk, and for whom, and with how much? Let's compare that to what's the cancer risk of obesity and what's the decrease in cancer risk from a significant weight loss. It's huge. It's orders of magnitude greater than what any potential speculated cancer risk would be from consuming diet sodas. So it can be a good strategy. It would be the same as if you had a sedentary individual and you asked them to get up and walk, take a 10-minute walk. Some people would claim that 10-minute walks aren't sufficient for cardiovascular fitness. There's the recent hullabaloo with Dr. Gabrielle Lyons, who everybody started attacking because she said it wasn't exercise, without watching the whole interview and understanding what she was really getting at. But I've talked about 10-minute walks being, great for cardio, and I've had people attack me saying they weren't sufficient for cardio. And then Gabrielle Lyons says it, all of a sudden they're attacking her for saying they are. So I just had I did a podcast with Chris Williamson recently, and I was talking about the 10-minute walks. And some people accused me of being a carbophobe or flexing about not doing cardio. And, I got attacked for the very opposite reason, because I suggested the 10-minute walks were sufficient. And people attacked me saying that they weren't. And then when Dr. Gabrielle Lyons suggests that they aren't exercise, everybody attacks her saying they are. Yeah. And these are the same group of people, the fitfluencers and medical professionals that virtue signal and we get into our start talking to each other. So I'm just kind of gone off on a side there, but there's a whole host. They do not increase the likelihood that you'll overeat. People suggest that consuming artificially sweetened beverages increase diabetes risk. That's not true either. There's a reverse causality with overweight people tend to drink more diet sodas because they're overweight and they're trying to cut their calories. Not because they didn't get overweight because they drank diet soda. It doesn't have an adverse effect on glycemia, and it does not have an adverse effect on appetite. Those have both been studied in human randomized controlled trials, and we see the outcomes suggest that neither of those are good arguments against diet sodas. I think there's better alternatives, water being one, although diet sodas showed an improvement over a comparative intake of water for weight loss. It was small, but because it gave people alternatives. Remember, we talked earlier about having alternatives. Instead of the ice cream, you've got yogurt and berries. Instead of the sugar-laden soda, you got a diet soda. It's a transition. This whole thing is an evolution. When you want to go from whole milk down to skim for whatever reason, if it's just calories, I'm not suggesting it's a healthier choice, you go from whole milk to 2%, and then you go to 1%. Yeah. If you want to reduce the amount of sugar that you put in your coffee in the morning, you go from 4 cubes to 3. Nobody said 3 was healthy, but it's healthier than 4. If calories and calorie reduction is your goal, and then you go to 2, and then you go to 1, and eventually you don't like sugar in your coffee. Hopefully that's where you end up. I actually enjoy the plainer food. People are always asking me, what seasonings do you use? What sauces? I don't use any sauces. I don't use ketchup. I don't use seasonings. I enjoy the taste of my food. I enjoy a plain potato. I actually enjoy it. I don't like the sour cream and butter on it. That's not appealing to me. I enjoy my sourdough bread. I like the taste, the fermented, I like the flavor of that. I don't need to put butter on it. It doesn't mean that you can't, if you want to, within the confines of your diet, but you get the point.
Yeah.
Facilitate some sort of progress you got to meet people where they're at and be cautious how much you change and whether or not they end up having binge behaviors because of over restriction. So we'll get there, but it's a process.
Yeah, for sure. If someone is I used to have sources, I wasn't into bodybuilding or any type of sport before. I did a bit of triathlon, then I went into bodybuilding. And even as a bodybuilder, it was like light mayo was my thing, and I was known for it. And now I don't have any sources at all. And I just love the food. I think it's back to that sort of where we were talking about the mythology of that mindful eating, enjoying your food, being present, and having a nice selection of food. It's like, I have some salt, but that's it. And I'm happy with that. And now, it's not demonizing not having those things, but certainly there needs to be a palate adaptation. And like you say, they're titrating things over time. This is where people go wrong. If you reverse things, the likelihood of binge eating or falling off the diet or never really being successful on a diet is so much higher. And the simple question as well that I got sent in was brown rice or white rice. Now, this is like the age-old argument of white potato or sweet potato.
Right.
Which one do you like?
Look, there's not much difference between the two, to be honest. There's like 1 gram of fiber. It's not significant or meaningful. I'd get much more fiber from alternate sources. It's like kind of the argument with probably opening up another can of worms, but when people talk about grass finished beef versus conventionally finished, grain finished beef, and they want to refer to the omega-3 content. Well, you don't get your omega-3s from beef. It's not a sufficient amount. It's not meaningful, right? Salmon has 200 times the amount of omega-3s as beef. So that's not why I'm there. When I'm eating beef, I'm eating it for iron, zinc, and B12. Yeah. And the same thing would be true when people talk about pink salt. It has 67 or 4,000 minerals or whatever the claims are. None of them are of a sufficient dose to provide you any meaningful benefit. It's the same reason that some supplement companies, some nefarious supplement companies, will use, what do they call those, proprietary formulas and not disclose how much of what particular ingredients are in there, because they don't put enough of the expensive ingredient in there to save costs that would provide you any benefit. If I told you that a certain product had 0.5 grams of creatine in it, you would quickly understand that the literature suggests you need about 3 to 5 grams consistently to get a performance benefit. So 0.5 is not, so you understand what I'm saying. Rice versus brown rice, very meaningful, very meaningless difference. Some people would refer to the glycemic index. The glycemic index is not a useful tool. Those numbers are tested in isolation. Nobody eats those foods in isolation. You eat everything with proteins and fats and fibers. And glycemic load can matter in terms of, but also blood sugar spikes, which has been highly demonized all over the internet as of late. It's the new thing. Get your CGM and avoid the spikes. It's a very normal physiological response. Carbs don't cause diabetes. Carbs can aggravate an existing case of diabetes, but it's caused by energy toxicity. It's caused by, first and foremost, exceeding your personal fat threshold, subcutaneous fat initially, and then eventually accumulating visceral fat around your organs, your liver, and then your pancreas. And that is what, if you don't have any place to put the carbs, your glycogen is full in your liver and your muscles, and your muscle or your fat threshold is exceeded, then you're going to start putting those extra calories into visceral fat. So I think some people with that whole carbohydrate insulin model are getting it backwards. They're saying that the insulin drives the obesity, but the obesity drives the insulin. It's just the opposite. And you can cure type 2 diabetes with, I use that word cautiously, with a high carb diet. In the 70s, we had a trial on people eating rice and sugar and honey, and they lost like 60 kilograms, and reversed their type 2 diabetes. And when I say reverse, some people have had type 2 diabetes, insulin-dependent type 2 diabetes for so long that their pancreas is no longer functional. But if you lose 15% of your body weight, a lot of folks who haven't had type 2 diabetes for very long will have pancreatic beta cell restoration, and you can cure type 2 diabetes. Some people prefer to call it maintain, because you can basically, overeat and recur and get type 2 diabetes again. But not a big deal. It's not a game changer. If that, I probably could have just said no difference and we'd be done with the conversation. But
it's helpful to have context.
I would say that brown rice, because some people, if they have digestion problems, can be a high FODMAP food for some people, and it might be a consideration. Listen to your body. How does it affect you, and in what dose? It's a little higher in arsenic than white rice, to be honest.
And your message there, it's certainly an individual response. And to sort of what you were talking about there as well, to continue on from that, a lot of the times when people start to follow a certain diet or cut out a food or something like this, it is, of course, you know, we look at the influencers putting this information out and we're like, why do you need to do this to our community? And, you know, a lot of shit is put out. But also on the flip side of that, the psychology behind the person that's consuming the content. Why are you resonating with X diet or demonizing X food? Is it something that's, you know, from your past or in your subconscious that actually you think, great, this would be something I can follow because I don't think that food's very good as well, but there's not education behind that. It's more of this sort of belief system that you have. And that's
Yeah,
important as well. It's not just the influencer, it's actually the person consuming it as well. I'm sure you'll agree.
100%. And the belief system's important. The best diet's the one you'll follow, and the people will generally proclaim the best diet to be the one that worked for them.
Yes.
But then to make claims about the general population or other people is inappropriate. And that doesn't mean that that diet didn't work for you. Now, what are the reasons why it worked? And those can be manyfold. You adhered to it. You stopped eating the crap food, which, you know, is an obvious improvement on any diet. Any dietary intervention is better than the standard American diet, that's for sure. You were able to adhere to it. Maybe you did have some digestive distress from particular foods that you cut out. And we see that even in the Sonnenberg trials out of Stanford with the fiber interventions, that a third of the people that increased their fiber had adverse reactions. Some people don't have the gut microbiome, either density or diversity, to handle, you know, particularly at that rate. I think they may have, I'm not sure how quickly they titrated the fiber intake up, but you got to be cautious.
Yeah.
Any extreme dietary change, we saw Joe Rogan talking about when he went on the keto diet and he had diarrhea for 2 weeks. Any extreme change is going to impact your small intestine and the water, the way that it is able to create the feces and the firmness of that, the stool quality is going to be affected by any extreme change in diet. More fiber, less fiber, more you know, different kinds of foods that you're not used to eating. So the best diet's the one you'll follow. There's lots of anecdotes. Keto people, you know, they have tons of people that had extraordinary improvement in their weight loss and their general health. You'll see the same thing from vegan people's claims. You'll see the same thing from carnivore people's claims. You know, I've got thousands of people all over the world who provided me testimonials over the year for the vertical diet. And everybody has testimonials, and anecdotes. It's what we call a selection bias, like that Harvard study on carnivore and how great everybody did on carnivore. Well, you're only talking to people who have been on carnivore for a number of years. That's a selection bias, you know, and I'm not judging that. I said in my Iceland seminar that the carnivore is the ultimate elimination diet. I mean, what else can you cut out? And that some people may have such extreme gastric distress. An elimination diet is commonly recommended by the FODMAP diet. Is one of the most effective. 40 to 60% of people who utilize the FODMAP diet for gastric distress realize some improvement in their symptoms. So it's one of the most. It's an elimination diet, which is why I say I lean into it, but I don't recommend it, you know, all year round. But it's a starting point. Much like keto might be a great intervention for somebody who's morbidly obese and diabetic to realize an immediate loss of weight, appetite, satiety, if that works for them. And I think Thomas DeLauer, you know, had the same result. He lost a significant amount of weight, and then eventually you can reincorporate other foods. And you know, Dr. Peter Attia was keto for 3 years, and after a while he's like, ugh, you know, what's the long-term dietary adherence? Is it necessary? Is it required? Is it the only path? Or can you start incorporating other foods after you've used that initial intervention to get the result that you were seeking, whether it's weight loss or digestion improvement or what have you? And it doesn't work for everybody. Everybody has different kind of responses to different diets. I would say this because it can get confusing. Now I'm like, you know, all over the place with what's the best diet. There's only 3 to choose from for weight loss. All diets fall into one of 3 categories, I should say. CR, DR, and TR. This I picked up from Dr. Peter Attia as a fantastic way of describing things, even though he was keto and intermittent fasting for years, and is now evolved. The CR is calorie restriction. We already talked about weighing and measuring your food and tracking all of your calories on an app, which I think is a fantastic way to learn about food, at least initially. That's one way to start a diet, and a very effective way for a lot of people. They're all equally effective, I should say. We studied all these, and they all seem to be equally effective, which is not a great thing. We should distinguish between effective. Most people who go on a diet lose weight. 6 out of 7 people who go on a diet lose weight. But long-term dietary adherence is poor. So when I say effective, you can lose weight on them, but can you sustain them for a long period of time? And evidence suggests, irrespective of diet, that most people will gain back at least some, 50% within the first year, gain back the weight, and each subsequent year has worse and worse long-term compliance. So I should say that. And so we had CR. DR is dietary restriction, and that's what we've been discussing. That's your keto or carnivore or vegan or paleo or Whole30, you name it. Anytime you restrict, demonize, eliminate a particular food, then there's a likelihood you're going to eat fewer total calories, particularly in an entire macro group. It's going to eliminate carbs. It's a pretty substantial number of calories. And carbs are often highly processed, ultra processed, highly palatable foods are often a combination of fats, carbs, and salt, right? That's your chips and your pastries and all those things. It's not just carbs. Nobody's mainlining spoonfuls of sugar. It's those particular foods that are, as we discussed earlier, the hedonic, you just want to continue eating them. So eliminating carbs automatically eliminates a lot of those foods that, it's not necessarily that the carbs are bad, it's that the combination of those foods now no longer exists. So that's dietary restriction, CRDR. TR is time restriction. That's your 68 or your OMAD a day or your alternate day fasting. Any restriction on the time at which you eat can help reduce calories simply because you're not eating as often. There's downsides to all of those. There's pros and cons. We could spend any amount of time talking about those. But like you said, people become pretty religious about whichever one of those they utilized, and they'll want to sing the praises. Oh, I did this and it worked great and everybody should do it. No, not everybody should do it. Everybody should have a plan and maybe experiment. Some people get mad at Mark Bell or even Paul Saladino, and often rightfully so, for having changed diets over the years. I like, Mark even went and said, try 30 days of this, then try 30 days of that. Go 30 days carnivore, go 30 days fasting, go 30 days, keto, whatever. He had the war on carbs. He eats carbs. Eventually most people do, they'll be honest with you. Even some of the most ardent carbophobes over the years that I've, Peter Attia being one, Mike Mutzel, who I love, is certainly a smart guy. He now incorporates carbohydrates around training so to optimize his training. Paul Saladino, carnivore MD, now eats carbs. The only holdout I've mentioned over the years is Sean Baker, Dr. Sean Baker, who performs at an extraordinary level. He's just a freak athlete. And he did say he tried to introduce apples recently. And here's somebody who's been carnivore for years, just starts throwing in a bunch of apples. And I would suggest that was a high FODMAP food, and that probably wasn't the best carb to introduce, particularly in massive quantities, right out of the gate. Anytime there's foods that you haven't been eating for a while, start small. Same would be true of milk, because your lactase enzyme downregulates when haven't been consuming dairy for a while, and you need to titrate small amounts of it to get it to upregulate. And that doesn't mean that there's no limit, but it does mean that you need, for some people, you need to get that lactase enzyme to upregulate. It'll be true of almost any food, as mentioned. When you make dramatic changes over a short period of time, your body's going to freak out and you might have some adverse effects. So, boy, I can't even remember what the original question was, to be honest with you.
Well, essentially, it's what we've been talking about the whole episode, food selection, diet selection, everything you're doing, it's so individual, and that can be down to genetics, that can be down to your childhood, that can be down to so many different things. It's super important for that self-acknowledgement as to what you're doing do you enjoy it, or can you seek some level of enjoyment from it? Maybe not the back
Yeah.
end of a prep, but generally speaking, do you enjoy what you're eating? Are you doing it for your own reasons, if it's a medical reason, or various other things? And you've
Yeah.
spoken about carnivore. That was with the carnivore, the last question was about what are your thoughts on carnivore and sort of the medical studies behind that. But I think you sort of answered that there without even knowing. You're like the oracle.
Yeah, selection bias, an elimination diet, and some people have and can benefit from the elimination diets. And I certainly wouldn't begrudge anybody that opportunity to feel better and make them feel guilty about their efforts to do so. And then, you talk about what the potential, we talk about the pros, and they talk about what the potential downsides are of that, which, there's a cost benefit to most things that you do in life, certainly with respect to medications, but also with diets. And if the benefits are outweighing the potential risks that people, I think often suffer from alarmism when they try and, talk about a particular individual's diet, again, look at the biomarkers. And that's one con that might be associated with the carnivore diet. One of the ones that I think is most loudly opposed by, dietitians in general, is that there's, how do I say this, a right and wrong way to do keto or carnivore. And I think that what they're concerned about is LDL cholesterol, is that some people who are either hyperabsorbers or don't sufficiently excrete or clear cholesterol from the system will see, with elevated saturated fat consumption, reduces the number of LDL receptors on the liver and will therefore cause a recirculation of LDL in the bloodstream, which is one of many risk factors for cardiovascular disease, is the accumulation of atherosclerotic plaque as a result of the ApoB, increase in ApoB, and the recirculation of that. So, and again, it's one of many. I mentioned that a keto diet or a carnivore diet that allows you to lose a significant amount of body weight actually improves your cardiovascular disease risk.
Is that
so you want to get blood tests and see how you respond, and then you get to weigh, if you've lost a significant amount of weight and you're no longer diabetic, type 2 diabetic or insulin resistance, you've dramatically reduced your cardiovascular disease risk. And maybe you're okay with a slightly elevated LDL. Even Sean Baker, I'm trying to think, Dan Feldman is the guy who has put forth the lean mass hyper-responder model, suggesting for those particular ultra healthy individuals that LDL doesn't appear to cause cardiovascular or increase cardiovascular disease risk and cause atherosclerotic plaque buildup. Testing, I think, using both coronary artery calcification and coronary angiography. The problem is even by his own estimates, it's only 1 in 30,000 people, and they have to have a really high HDL, a very low LDL and triglycerides. And even Sean Baker said, look, you don't want to completely dismiss LDL. It is an independent risk factor, but it's one of many. And you just don't want to let it skyrocket to 300 plus. You got to be cautious of that, as you would with familial hypercholesterolemia. But there are specific individuals who seem to be potentially less, I don't want to say immune, but less subject to cardiovascular disease risk because there are other health factors. So there's pros and cons with the carnivore diet, and some people really enjoy it. And I'm cautious to try and, I'm really careful to try not to rain on someone's parade. I just want them to be aware of what dietary pattern seems to lead to the longest, not just the longest life, but the healthiest lifespan, right? Not just lifespan, but health span. Yeah. And incorporating a more diverse diet, generally speaking, keeping saturated fats on the lower end, which I've always recommended, leaner foods, and then getting blood tests to see how you respond to that diet. I wanted to say really quickly, because you mentioned genetics and BMI. There are some genetic factors for obesity. Yeah. Most of those seem to be associated with hunger signaling. Not necessarily that you're just born to be fat, but you're born to be hungrier, potentially, have less ghrelin, which is your hunger hormone, or more ghrelin release, which also happens with obesity. You become leptin resistant. Leptin is your satiety hormone. And if two people sit down and one person has more ghrelin and has leptin resistance, they'll keep eating more food longer before they feel satiated, whereas somebody else might feel satiated sooner. That's kind of one of the primary drive, I think the most significant genetic impact. And we know this from, I think, the information that we've gleaned from all the studies on the GLP-1 agonists, the semaglutide and others. It helps those people improve their satiety, and they end up losing a significant amount of weight for an extended period of time. This is not to break into a whole new conversation about the pluses and minuses of that. That's another hour to itself.
Yeah,
it's just to say that we know. Yeah, it's just to say that we know that satiety, how important satiety is, and how hunger signaling is a driver of obesity, because we are able to manipulate that with medication and see extraordinary results for long-term dietary adherence. I think long-term dietary adherence, 2-year dietary adherence on average was about a 2% weight loss in most of these studies. And with the semaglutide and the new tirzepatide, the dual agonists, 23% sustained weight loss over 2 years. It's extraordinary. Which reversal of type 2 diabetes, dramatic decrease in cardiovascular disease risk, dramatic decrease in cancer risk. And then, you've got people like Jillian Michaels running around saying that it's going to be the death of us to take semaglutide, when we've, it's shameful to me that that these desperate people, nobody can claim to have that kind of outcome results. Nobody's diet plan, not carnivore, not keto. Those have been studied for years, for 30, 40, 50 years. And nobody can claim 23% sustained weight loss. And there's going to be obviously some cost benefit to the medications. And it causes some people speaking outside of their area of expertise to make claims that well exceed what the research suggests in terms of what those risks are. And so, again, that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
BMI. So that was genetics. BMI. We've looked at people with similar lean body mass. One person with a low BMI, one person with a high BMI, overweight or suffering from obesity. They have an equivalent BMI, basal metabolic rate. They burn the same number of calories a day. I know that overweight people will sometimes claim that they have a slow metabolism. And we just don't see that in the evidence, or that as people age, their metabolism slows. We don't see that either. We see that their non-exercise activity slows. We see that their caloric intake increases. And this isn't to blame the victim. This isn't to say that these overweight people are at fault, but they do need to be aware that that's not the reason. That's not the cause. The cause is the hunger. If they think it's because they have a slow metabolism, then they're inclined to go out and try and get pumped up full of thyroid medication or take fat burners or, blah, blah, blah. Or that they have some sort of pathological condition that's causing the obesity that's not within their ability to correct. What they have is they have increased hunger signaling. And it's entirely understandable why they eat more. And so they need to focus on that with satiety interventions, hopefully lifestyle, as we spent an enormous amount of time discussing today. And then for those people who are, severe health risk, who are yo-yo dieted and can't keep the weight off, then there are medications for that as well that are very effective for weight loss because they manage hunger.
Yeah, for sure. It's we've covered so much, Stan, but
I know.
Like I said, it's like we could continue talking, but of course I would love to have you back on in the future. And I know that our previous episode did very well, because I feel like, you have the education there, but you also practice what you preach, and you've done incredibly well in the sport. And for whatever reason that is, whichever one people resonate with, because people are drawn to different things, you can see that Stan has all levels of success across his life. And listening to his podcast today, hopefully the listeners can actually, if they have a look who you are, and maybe they know who you are already, will understand that a lot of what we're talking is to educate and empower people. And people can rely on us, Stan, of course, to bring the truths to the nutrition world as much as possible.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've always said it's 1% information and it's 99% execution. I say compliance is the science. And so the knowledge piece is very small. We've talked about a ton of things, mainly because there's so much disinformation, misinformation out there, and people get distracted by things that aren't going to really be beneficial to them. And we have to reel them back in and say, no, that's, and there's all the what abouts. Well, what about this? What about that? What about, and it's like, it's really 1% information. We covered it. It's very, very brief, and pick the diet and let's get going. But the getting going, setting having a goal, making a plan, and then finding methods, habits, lifestyle behaviors that allow you to achieve that goal is where all of the real work, progress is made. I hate to call it work because it should be something that's, some part of your lifestyle that you enjoy. It's 99% execution. Compliance is the science, and all the tools that we have in our toolbox to help make that happen.
Yeah, and guys, give yourself time. Of course, there is short diets and what have you, but if you are on a big weight loss journey, etc., try and find enjoyment out of, like I touched on earlier, finding enjoyment in what you're doing is super important, and that feeds into where you say whatever diet you choose, you want to adhere to it for a long period of time. And if you can find ways to think, this is great, I'm changing my lifestyle, I'm changing my physique, I'm improving my health, include people around you, be transparent and educate yourself as much as you can, although be selective. Please, guys, be selective of who you choose to follow and consume their content. But thank you so much, Stan. You are a hero. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
No, I appreciate you. And of course, we will get you on for a third episode. But guys, if you listen and you enjoy the episode, tag us on Instagram stories or follow Stan. I'll put his Instagram handle in the description. And until next time, Stan, have a brilliant day. Thank you.
Hey!